So, you will recall that we were talking about food webs when we left off last time. And we had talked about the different uses to which we put food webs. At the top, we have just the connectedness web, which tells us who interacts with who. In the middle, we have the energy flow web that gives us some sense of the amount of energy that is transferred from one organism to another. And then at the bottom, we have the functional web, which defines the keystone relationships that are important for maintaining species diversity. So these you can measure by just looking at who eats who. These you actually have to calculate the amount that is eaten. And here, none of that matters. You have to do experiments in which you selectively remove one of these species to see if the food web remains stable or if a lot of extinctions follow from removing that species. So, as it turns out, there are only a few links in this whole food web that are important in maintaining the diversity of the web, and that is because Strongylocentris and Catharina up here regulate crucial competitors down here. If they get too abundant, they get eaten by these two, and that prevents them from causing competitive exclusion. So if these guys cannot drive anybody else extinct, then you maintain not only the diversity here, but you maintain the diversity among their consumers. But you cannot establish functional relationships without doing experiments. That is really crucial to understand. This is just observing, this is actually measuring energy transfer, but this is experiments. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about when we talk about food webs is about trophic cascades. So our focus on food webs so far has been on species, right? Species diversity. How competitors sort themselves out within a trophic level and how the trophic relationships between levels help to regulate those things. So we've been talking about species diversity. We have not been talking about biomass at all. So what we've been talking about is, does corallina go extinct, or is it part of the community? But we haven't asked how much corallina is there. Is there a lot or is there a little? Either way, it's in the community. But if there's 10 kilograms of this stuff per square meter, that's a really different thing than if there's like 1 gram per square meter. So we can ask about species diversity, and that's what our focus has been, but let's take a minute before we leave this topic and talk also about biomass. So trophic cascades are an approach to food webs that focuses on biomass. Now, when we talk about species diversity, we're interested in something that's really engaging to basic biologists. Like, how many species are there? But you know what? For applied scientists, that sometimes doesn't matter. Applied scientists are always more interested in how much there is and how much of it could we use. So rather than the number of species, if we're managing an ecological system for harvest, we might be way more interested in the biomass of species rather than the diversity of species. So here's our little example food web here, and here's our producers and some consumers, and here's some secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. Great. Okay, well, notice that the trophic levels all interact with each other, right? So how does changing the amount of the number or biomass of these tertiary consumers change the biomass of the other levels? That's a really interesting question, and it's a really important question for ecology because often what we do changes the number or biomass of species at a particular trophic level. And that should have predictable consequences for all the other trophic levels. So let's think about this. If we increase the number of steelhead trout, say by backing up a big truck from a fishery and dumping 10 million larval steelhead trout into a lake, what would happen? Well, we have then augmented the number of consumers up here, right? So what's that going to do to their prey? If you have more consumers, what will it do to the prey? Dolina, what will it do to the prey? More consumers eating stuff, what should happen to the prey? Lower biomass, yes, exactly. So that should reduce the biomass of their prey. So you have more stuff up here, you have less stuff here. Don't these guys consume something also? What would that do to the producers here if you have fewer herbivores? Taylor, you're looking alert this morning. Fewer herbivores, what happens to the plants in terms of biomass? It increases, yes. So look, this is not precisely a 3 or 4 level thing. It's kind of intermediate. But for our purposes, let's treat it as a 3-level trophic web. So increasing the consumers here decreases the consumers here, which frees the plants from predation, and they increase. So increase causes a decrease, which allows these guys to increase. Okay, so look, we have an alternating impact here. If we increase the biomass at one level, at the top level, we will decrease the intermediate level, and that increases the bottom level. Increase, decrease, increase. If we were to remove all of these guys by overfishing, then you have no top consumers. So, Michelle, if we have no top consumers, what happens to these consumers here? They'll increase. And what will that do to the plants? Wayne, what will that do to the plants? If these guys increase?
There'll be less.
Less plants. Decrease, increase, decrease. It's an alternating cascade of effects, which is why we call it a trophic cascade. If you alter things at one level, you will alter all the other levels in terms of biomass, and the alteration that you do will alternate through the levels in your food web. Okay, now what we just talked about is what we call top-down regulation. So we're assuming that these guys control these guys, and that these guys in turn control the plants. Control goes from the top consumers down to the plants. Is that the way all food webs are organized? Not necessarily. There are some food webs in which it's much more influential how much production there is. So if you increase the plants, that should increase these guys and increase these guys as well. You should get a different pattern. So bottom up is just a straightforward increase of the food base, which should increase everybody. But if it's a top-down effect, then you are altering the predatory relationships and you get this alternating effect. So bottom up versus top down regulation is a big thing in community ecology these days. We're trying to understand in terms of species that we might be interested in exploiting ourselves, what regulates their biomass? Is it predation relationships or is it the availability of food? We have to do experiments to do these things, and we have to do pretty much exactly the experiments as I framed them when we were talking about it. We have to either augment the top level or augment the bottom level. Now, if it's a top-down effect, and we augment the top level, that should cause the classic decrease here and increase here. But if we augment the top level and nothing happens, we just have a bunch of starving consumers here, then what's happening is not top-down regulation, it's bottom-up. Because you don't have the effect. If we augment the amount of plant material that there is to consume and we don't get any effect here, well, then it can't be bottom-up regulation. Because bottom-up regulation says the more food, the more you have. But if you add plants here and you don't get an effect, that's a tip-off that the top predators are regulating these guys, not the availability of food. So we can tell by experiments what regulates things, and the key response variable is often the intermediate levels here. So if we increase food, does this increase? If it's yes, that's probably bottom-up regulation. If no, it's almost certainly top-down regulation. If we increase the number of predators here, do these guys decrease? If so, that's probably top-down. But if they don't decrease, they're probably responding to food, not predation. So this is a series of experimental ideas that we can apply to real ecosystems. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'll just give you one example of a trophic cascade that actually has some fairly strong effects. So what we've done here is gone to a lake and we've put out a fish fence, more or less, and we've enclosed an area. And what we've done is asked, well, okay, let's exclude the fish or let's enclose the fish and see what the effect on the rest of the levels in the trophic web are. So enclosing fish over an area of stream bed reduces algae. So more fish, less algae. Now what did we just talk about in the previous slide? We said increase fish, decrease consumers should increase algae. Why does this decrease algae? Taylor, you have an idea. How many levels are we talking about? Are we talking about 3 levels or are we talking about 4 levels? If you increase fish and you decrease invertebrate consumers of algae, then algae should increase. But is that what's going on here? Or do we have 4 levels? Increase fish, decrease tiny predators, increase herbivores, decrease algae. That's what's going on here. We have an extra trophic level. So we increase the fish, and that increases the density of herbivores because we have 4 levels in this particular food web. We have fish, we have predatory insects that eat these herbivores. So we have top consumers, we have secondary consumers, which are predatory insects, we have herbivorous insects, and we have algae. We still get the opposite effect at each stage. It's just that when we talked about it in the previous slide, we only had 3 levels. So increasing fish, decreasing herbivores, increasing algae. Here we have 4 levels. Increase fish, decrease predatory insects, increase herbivorous insects, decrease algae. You still get the opposite effect at each trophic level. But the number of levels is then crucial. You have to know how many levels you're dealing with. Here we have 4. Fish, predatory insects that eat herbivorous insects, which eat algae. Okay? So questions about trophic cascades. They're a bit different. They focus on biomass. We still have to do experiments to get at this, just as if we were looking at keystone species and trying to understand species diversity. This is kind of the analogy to analyzing a trophic web for a keystone species. You must do a manipulation. You must add or you must subtract a species in order to see the effect. Okay, the number of trophic levels then determines what the effects are and how they sort out. They are opposite effects. Whatever you do to the top level has the opposite effects on the middle level, which has the opposite effect on the next level down, and as far down as you can go. Generally, we're using either 3 or 4 level systems. So if you manipulate the top level, you're going to get an increase in the bottom level. If it's 3, if it's 4 levels, if you increase the top level, you will decrease the bottom level because it goes increase, decrease, increase, decrease, like that. So your book has a couple of more examples in its discussion. Are we good? Yay. All right. I was thinking we would start doing a little review for later exams, but I think I'm going to skip those slides today. So we're just going to, when we get to them, we'll skip them. But now we're going to do some succession. All right, so trophic organization then tells us how a community is organized in a given place. But communities change over time, and trying to understand how communities change over time has been a huge area of research in community ecology. So we call this ecological succession, and it's the temporal change in the species composition of a community over time. And we will cover these topics: primary versus secondary succession. We'll talk about characteristics of successional species, which should be very familiar to you already because it'll be a review from a previous lecture. We'll talk about the limits on this concept, and then we'll finish up talking about mechanisms of succession. Different things go on in different kinds of communities, and we recognize 3 different mechanisms depending on the community. Now, the first thing to understand is that when we talk about succession, we could talk about either animals or plants. For convenience sake, we usually talk about plant communities because plants don't run away. If you try to count them, they're going to stay put, and you can come back and count them again. So we typically use plants as examples in succession when we talk about this. But it applies to animals also. It's just that we assume, well, okay, the animals follow the plants. They're going to succeed just exactly the way the plants do. And we can take a shortcut and just focus on the plants. All right, so as I said, we usually refer to plant communities, animal communities do it, but let's talk then about primary versus secondary succession. Primary succession is succession that is change in species composition over time where there was not a pre-existing community, where you might think of it as new land that had no biological community on it previously. Secondary succession occurs in an area that had a pre-existing community that got disturbed. So they can be quite different. Secondary succession usually has remnants of the previous community. And if it's a plant community that we're talking about, as is usually the case, there are seeds in the soil from those previous species. And we have to take those into account. So primary and secondary succession operate differently. Let's give you an example of primary succession. So in the Great Lakes, the Great Lakes are retreating. And the Great Lakes were formed by glaciers 2 miles thick that abandoned the area about 12,000 years ago. And because the weight of 2 miles of ice pressing down on the land depressed the land, when that ice is gone, the land is now slowly rising. So the shores of the Great Lakes are slowly rising up, and the water is gradually retreating. As the water retreats, it exposes bare sand, which is colonized first by grasses, and you can get annual grasses and then perennial grasses, and basically they build soil into this sand. And when a certain amount of soil has formed, you can start to get shrubs colonizing. They cannot colonize bare sand because there's no nutrients in the bare sand. They need some fully developed soil. But then finally, when you start getting shrubs living and growing and dying and decaying and enriching the soil, then you can start to get trees. So you can go to the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore and you can actually walk from the edge of the water across this entire sequence in about, less than a quarter mile. Because it takes about 100 to 150 years to go through this process. And the rate at which the land is rising on the lakeshore means that in about a quarter mile you will have moved about 150 years of land rise from bare sand to colonization by grasses, colonization by larger plants, and then trees. Okay. So this is a really common thing in nature. It happens all the time. Here are some ponds filling in with sediment, and you can see that you have open water here, and you have these plants at the edges, and as this pond sort of starts to fill in with soil, you move from open water to these emergent plants that are rooted in water but sort of holding the mud at the edge of the pond, to plants that are more suited to dry land. And here you see them around the edges now of a pond that's filling in. This is an old beaver pond, by the way. And then at the end of the process, you get shrubs first and then trees. So this community in a single space, a single spot in space, has changed dramatically over time. The species that characterize the community used to be aquatic species, and now they are spruce hemlock trees. spruce and hemlock trees. But it takes hundreds of years for this to happen. So these are two examples of primary succession. In both cases, with sand emerging from under the water, there was no pre-existing terrestrial plant community. Here, with a beaver pond, that's been there hundreds of years. There's no pre-existing terrestrial plant community, and you wind up with trees. Let's use an example of secondary succession for comparison. So this is actually a very famous experiment that took place in Poland. We have some agricultural fields that were abandoned, and they started to succeed back into forest. And what happened first was that seeds in the soil from the surrounding species started to grow up once the farm was abandoned. And the first things that germinated were small things like grasses, like small herbs. And then they started to form this sort of low herbaceous canopy. Later on, you got more trees and small trees and shrubs colonizing. And then after 50 years or so, you got what looked like a young forest. So after about 5 years, it looked like this. After about 15, it was kind of really dense and brushy. 50 years in, you still have a lot of plants in the understory here, but you have a young forest now. 70 years on, these trees are larger and the herbaceous plants are dying out. And then 150 years later, you have a mature forest, and you could not tell that this used to be an abandoned agricultural field. So this is a chronosequence, as we say, on a specific spot in Poland that's been followed for over 150 years. The power of succession is truly remarkable. I used to work in Panama on Barrow, Colorado Island, which is a nature preserve, and it has these enormous tropical trees. So big that 10 of you holding hands could not get around the base of that tree. Okay, and it looks so primeval. There are jaguars there. There are tapirs. There's harpy eagles, for God's sake. A harpy eagle is an eagle that's about that big, if it's a female. Looks like it could carry off a small child, and in fact they can. They don't usually do that. They usually go for monkeys. But it looks for all the world like nobody has ever lived there. As it turns out, 500 years ago, it was a cornfield. And the Native Americans who were cultivating that corn got smallpox from the expedition that the Spaniards sent to establish Panama City, Panama, and they all died. And their fields succeeded back into tropical forest. You'd never know. Okay, we see succession all over the place, and sometimes it's in abandoned areas that we produce, but sometimes it's completely natural. And here's a series of gaps in the White Mountains of New Hampshire where the wind has blown the trees down. So this is a mature forest here on this leading edge, and the wind comes in and just knocks the trees down. And then on a trailing edge, this is succession. This is herbs growing up, and then shrubs, and then succeeding back into forest. So this gap here started down here and gradually worked its way upslope as the wind blew down these trees that were exposed, and the back end of the gap filled in through succession. So here you get dead trees and grasses, and here you get shrubs starting to colonize. Here you get small trees, middle trees, large trees. So this is extraordinarily common in nature. Okay, now I'm going to skip these next slides because I don't think we need to do this. So, what are the characteristics of early and late successional species? Well, these should be very familiar to you. Early successional species find these gaps, these opportunities where there's not much competition for light. After all, if there's new land, there's not an existing community. There's no competition for light. If it's a disturbance, the existing community has gone away, and there's no competition for light. So if you are trying to find those conditions, you're an early successional specialist. What helps you disperse from your parent to one of these early successional opportunities that has lots of light? Well, it would help if, as a plant, you produced a lot of seeds and that they were small, because small seeds are easier to move around. So early successional species tend to have many small seeds. They tend to be easily dispersed, and commonly by wind, okay, because wind just blows these tiny seeds all over creation. And in that case, you have a good chance of randomly finding one of these gaps, one of these opportunities. The other thing about it is that you could grow in one of these gaps, and then as other plants take over from you, you die, right? But if your seeds lasted long enough, they might live long enough to experience high light levels again if there was a disturbance in the future. So frequently, these early successional plants have long seed lifespans, and they just wait it out until another disturbance occurs. Okay, so low root to shoot ratio, these guys are not investing in lots of roots to anchor them for the long run. They're trying to grow as fast as they can, reproduce as fast as they can, and get their reproduction done before they get outshaded by better competitors. Okay, so they grow quickly and they reproduce at small sizes, and they don't tolerate shade. What do these characteristics remind you of? Many offspring, small offspring, rapid growth, small age at maturity, at first reproduction. Can anybody think of where we've seen that collection of characteristics before? Well, yes, but I'm thinking more in terms of a theoretical construct in ecology. Many offspring, small offspring, early age first reproduction, small body size, rapid growth, life histories. This is an R-selected life history. Rapid growth and reproduction. So it's come back to haunt you. Better go back and review that. Since this is R-selected, what would you guess? This would be very likely K-selected. So late successional species, they come in where there's an existing plant community and they have to compete for resources. What makes you a good competitor? Being large. What makes you large? Being a large baby. Few seeds, large seeds. In order to get your seeds dispersed, you have to rely on animals usually. Seed viability tends to be relatively short because you want to get to a spot and immediately start growing and competing. The root to shoot ratio is high because you're trying to put down roots so that you can establish a competitive base. Okay, slow growth rate, large size, high shade tolerance. These are K-selected. Okay, let's look at an example here. Here are some plants that are subject to different levels of competition for light, and these are seeds kept in shaded conditions for 3 months, and here's the mortality. So here's small seeded species have greater mortality among trees, but large seeded species have less mortality. So if you are going to compete in a really well-established plant community, if you are going to be a late successional species, you'd better have big seeds. You'd better aspire to be a big dominant plant that shades all the other plants out. Okay. One of the things that we need to look at is, when we look at succession, is what are the mature trees in a community and what are the seedlings? Because the mature trees are the forest today, but the little ones, the seedlings, that's tomorrow's forest. So if we compare the frequency of adult trees here to the frequency of seedlings, you can see that a lot of these species are not going to persist. Oaks have no seedlings, but beeches have lots of seedlings. This is evidence that this community is going to succeed into a forest that is predominantly red maple, beech, and sugar maple. And these oaks, they're going to go away over time. Okay. Now, we have a tendency to classify succession in terms of stages. So we have the herbaceous stage. We have the shrub stage. We have the early tree stage. We have the late successional tree stage. And we call these SERE, S-E-R-E, which will be on the study guide. So these are stages in succession. Now, at some point, if you don't have a disturbance, you'll reach a community composition in which the species in that community replace themselves and are not replaced by anything else. So that is a self-perpetuating, consistent community kind of at the end of this successional sequence. Herbs to shrubs to small trees to large trees to climax. So we call it a climax community. A climax community is a community that replaces itself and is not replaced by any other community. Herbs are shaded out by shrubs. Shrubs are shaded out by small trees. Small trees are shaded out by large trees. The initial set of large trees is shaded out by the climax community in a typical successional sequence. So there's this tendency to kind of make an equivalency between succession and the growth of an organism, and to think of, say, the climax as the mature community and the herbs and shrubs and small trees as the immature community. That doesn't really work. We haven't really thought that way since the middle of the last century, but it was a really common way of thinking early in the history of ecology. One of the things that changed our mind on this is stuff like this. This is circular succession. Okay, so this is in England, you have this heath community. Okay, and the wind blows from this way to this way, and it sort of tears up the shrubs and kills them eventually. So it leaves bare ground. Okay, well, bare ground is colonized by sandberry, and then sandberry is outcompeted by calluna. So this is calluna. So what you see is this progression of basically stripes of vegetation as the wind kills the calluna and opens up bare ground, which is then colonized by the second species, sandberry, which is then outcompeted by calluna, which is then killed by the wind. So it's really a legitimate question. What's the climax community? Well, there is none. So it's possible to push this analogy too far, and we try not to do that anymore. But this issue of temporal change in community structure is a big issue in ecology, and we will come back to it in the future when we talk about diversity.